The morning mist hung heavy over Eldoria Castle, as Captain Marcus Blackwood stood at attention in the grand throne room. His silver armor gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, and his hand rested firmly on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. For 15 years he had served as the head of the royal guard, protecting the crown with unwavering loyalty. But today, everything would change. Queen Isabella sat regally on the ancient throne, her emerald crown catching the light that streamed through the stained glass windows. Beside her stood Queen Consort Victoria, a woman who had married into the royal family 5 years ago, after the tragic death of Queen Isabella's first husband, King Edmund. Victoria's ambitious nature had been evident from the beginning, but the royal court had accepted her for the sake of stability. Prince Alexander, the rightful heir to the throne, paced nervously near the great oak doors. At 28, he possessed all the qualities of a future king: wisdom, compassion, and a deep love for his people. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his blue eyes reflected the weight of responsibility he carried. Today was supposed to be a routine ceremony, but Alexander sensed something was amiss. The tension in the room was palpable as various nobles and court officials gathered for what they believed would be a simple state announcement. Lady Margaret, the kingdom's chief advisor, whispered urgently with Lord Harrison, the treasurer. Their faces bore expressions of concern that had been growing over the past several months. Queen Consort Victoria had been making subtle moves to consolidate power, using her charm and political cunning to win over key members of the nobility. She had successfully convinced several influential lords that Prince Alexander was too young and inexperienced to rule effectively. Her own background remained somewhat mysterious. She claimed to be from a distant noble house, but Captain Blackwood had always harbored suspicions about her true origins. The ceremony began with the traditional horn fanfare, echoing through the stone corridors of the ancient castle. Queen Isabella rose from her throne, her voice carrying the authority of centuries of royal bloodline. She announced that recent investigations had uncovered disturbing evidence about Queen Consort Victoria's past, evidence that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Captain Blackwood stepped forward, presenting a leather-bound folder containing documents that his most trusted guards had spent weeks verifying. The papers revealed that Victoria had previously been married to a rival kingdom's prince, making her marriage to the Eldorian crown legally invalid. More shocking still, the documents suggested she had been planted as a spy, tasked with weakening Eldoria from within. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled court. Victoria's face remained composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she maintained her regal posture. She had not expected her carefully constructed facade to crumble so dramatically. For years, she had played the role of the devoted queen consort while secretly working to position herself as the true power behind the throne. Prince Alexander felt a mixture of relief and anger wash over him. He had always felt uncomfortable around Victoria, sensing that her affections toward his mother were not entirely genuine. Her attempts to influence royal decisions had become increasingly bold, and she had even suggested that perhaps the kingdom needed a more experienced ruler than a young prince. The nobles began murmuring among themselves, their loyalty clearly shifting as the implications of Victoria's deception became clear. Lord Harrison, who had been one of Victoria's strongest supporters, now looked pale and shaken. He realized how close the kingdom had come to falling under foreign influence. Captain Blackwood's investigation had been thorough and discreet. His network of loyal guards had traced Victoria's movements before her arrival in Eldoria, uncovering a trail of correspondence with agents from the neighboring kingdom of Ravencrest. The letters revealed a carefully orchestrated plan to infiltrate the Eldorian court and gradually assume control over the kingdom's resources and military. Queen Isabella's voice grew, stronger as she detailed the extent of Victoria's betrayal. The queen consort had been slowly poisoning the queen's mind against her own son, suggesting that Alexander was too idealistic and would lead the kingdom to ruin. She had also been secretly meeting with foreign dignitaries, sharing sensitive information about Eldoria's defenses and trade agreements. The most damning evidence came from a coded letter that Captain Blackwood's men had intercepted just days before the ceremony. In it, Victoria reported to her handlers that she was close to convincing Queen Isabella to name her as regent, effectively bypassing Prince Alexander's claim to the throne entirely. As the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed, Victoria finally spoke. Her voice was steady, but there was a dangerous glint in her eyes. She neither confirmed nor denied the allegations, instead speaking about the greater good and the need for strong leadership in uncertain times. Her words were carefully chosen, designed to plant seeds of doubt about the evidence presented against her. Prince Alexander watched his stepmother with a mixture of fascination and disgust. He marveled at how convincingly she could maintain her innocence even when faced with overwhelming proof of her guilt. It became clear that Victoria was a master manipulator who had nearly succeeded in her mission to undermine the Eldorian throne. The atmosphere in the throne room grew, increasingly tense as Queen Isabella prepared to pronounce judgment. The ancient laws of Eldoria were clear about the punishment for treason, but Victoria's status as queen consort complicated matters. The decision would set a precedent that would be remembered for generations. Captain Blackwood stood ready to enforce whatever decision his queen would make. His hand never left his sword hilt and his eyes remained fixed on Victoria, watching for any sign that she might attempt to flee or resist. The other guards positioned throughout the room were equally prepared, their loyalty to the crown absolute. The morning that had begun with routine ceremony was transforming into a pivotal moment in Eldorian history. The kingdom's future hung in the balance as Queen Isabella prepared to strip Victoria of her title and restore the natural order of succession. The revelation had exposed not just one woman's treachery, but a complex web of foreign interference that threatened the very independence of the realm. As the tension reached its peak, everyone in the throne room understood that they were witnessing the end of one chapter in Eldoria's story and the beginning of another. The crown would soon pass to Prince Alexander, but not before the kingdom dealt with the betrayal that had nearly destroyed it from within. Queen Isabella's voice echoed through the throne room like thunder rolling across the mountains. With ceremonial precision, she declared that by the ancient laws of Eldoria and the sacred trust of the crown, Victoria's marriage to the royal family was null and void. The words carried the weight of centuries, each syllable carefully pronounced to ensure there would be no misunderstanding of the gravity of this moment. Victoria's composure finally cracked as the reality of her situation became undeniable. Her carefully constructed mask of royal dignity slipped away, revealing the calculating woman beneath. She had spent 5 years building relationships, gaining trust, and positioning herself for ultimate power, only to see it all crumble in a single morning. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any ally who might speak in her defense, but found only faces filled with shock and disappointment. Captain Blackwood stepped forward at Queen Isabella's silent command. His movements were measured and respectful, but there was an unmistakable finality in his approach. The removal of royal titles was not merely a symbolic gesture, it involved the physical reclaiming of all symbols of authority and position. Victoria would leave the castle with nothing that connected her to the Eldorian crown. The ceremony of title removal was ancient and rarely performed. Captain Blackwood first approached the crown that Victoria wore, a smaller, elegant piece that marked her status as queen consort. His hands were steady as he lifted it from her head, the jewels catching the light one final time before being placed on a velvet cushion held by a young page. The symbolism was powerful and immediate. Victoria was no longer royalty. Next came the rings that marked her marriage to the crown. Victoria's hands shook as she removed the elaborate wedding band and the signet ring that had allowed her to act with royal authority. Each piece of jewelry represented power she had wielded and influence she had gained through deception. As they were taken away, her connection to the throne was severed completely. Prince Alexander watched the proceedings with complex emotions. While he felt vindicated that his instincts about Victoria had been correct, he also felt sorrow for his mother, who had been betrayed by someone she had trusted and welcomed into their family. The young prince understood that this experience would make Queen Isabella more cautious about future relationships, potentially isolating her in a world where trust was already a luxury. The assembled nobles began to understand the full implications of what they were witnessing. Many of them had supported Victoria's suggestions and had even advocated for her to have greater influence in kingdom affairs. Now they realized how close they had come to participating in their own kingdom's downfall. Lord Harrison, in particular, looked devastated as he recalled the conversations where he had praised Victoria's wisdom and political acumen. Lady Margaret stepped forward to formally record the proceedings in the royal chronicles. As the kingdom's chief advisor, she had the responsibility to document this historic moment for future generations. Her quill moved swiftly across the parchment, capturing every detail of Victoria's disgrace and the evidence that had led to her downfall. These records would serve as a warning to future courts about the dangers of foreign infiltration. Victoria finally found her voice, but instead of pleading or showing remorse, she launched into a passionate defense of her actions. She spoke about the weakness she perceived in Eldoria's leadership and claimed that her intervention had been necessary to prevent the kingdom from falling into chaos. Her words revealed the depth of her contempt for the very people who had welcomed her into their midst. Captain Blackwood listened to Victoria's speech with growing anger. As a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the crown, he found her justifications particularly offensive. She spoke as if her betrayal had been a noble sacrifice, when in reality she had been working to deliver his beloved kingdom into the hands of its enemies. His jaw clenched as she continued her self-serving monologue. The foreign conspiracy became clearer as Victoria spoke. She revealed details about Ravencrest's long-term strategy to weaken Eldoria through internal manipulation rather than direct military conflict. Her marriage into the royal family had been just one, part of a larger plan that included economic sabotage and the gradual replacement of loyal Eldorian officials with individuals sympathetic to Ravencrest's interests. Queen Isabella remained silent during Victoria's outburst, her face a mask of royal composure. Internally, she was processing the magnitude of her misjudgment. She had allowed this woman into her family, shared state secrets with her, and even considered some of her political suggestions. The betrayal was both personal and professional, cutting deeply into her confidence as both a mother and a ruler. Prince Alexander began to see his future role more clearly. The near disaster with Victoria had shown him how vulnerable the kingdom could be to manipulation and deception. As the future king, he would need to be even more vigilant than his predecessors, carefully vetting anyone who sought to gain influence in the royal court. The lesson was harsh but necessary. The ceremony reached its climax as Queen Isabella formally banished Victoria from the kingdom. The sentence was exile rather than execution, partly out of consideration for the diplomatic complications that Victoria's death might create with Ravencrest, and partly because Queen Isabella still retained enough compassion to spare the life of someone who had once been family. Despite her treachery, Captain Blackwood was tasked with escorting Victoria from the castle immediately. She would be allowed to take only personal belongings that had no connection to her royal status. The captain assigned his most trusted guards to ensure that she left Eldoria's borders within 3 days and never returned. Any attempt to re-enter the kingdom would be considered an act of war. As Victoria was led away, she turned back for one final look at the throne room. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that suggested this might not be the end of her story. She had lost this particular battle, but the war between Eldoria and Ravencrest was far from over, and she still possessed valuable knowledge about the kingdom's inner workings. The remaining nobles began to discuss the implications of Victoria's removal among themselves. Trust had been shattered, and everyone wondered who else might have been compromised by foreign influence. The discovery of one spy inevitably led to questions about whether there might be others still hidden within the court, waiting for their opportunity to strike. Queen Isabella finally spoke again, her voice carrying both sadness and determination. She announced that Prince Alexander would immediately assume greater responsibilities in preparation for his eventual coronation. The kingdom needed strong, trustworthy leadership, and she was confident that her son possessed the qualities necessary to guide Eldoria through these troubled times. The throne room slowly emptied as the ceremony concluded, but the impact of the morning's events would resonate throughout the kingdom for years to come. Victoria's betrayal had been exposed and punished, but the scars left behind would take much longer to heal. The crown was safe, but the price of that safety had been a harsh lesson in the dangers of misplaced trust. The great doors of Eldoria Castle closed with a resounding thud as Victoria disappeared into the misty morning, escorted by Captain Blackwood's most trusted guards. The sound echoed through the throne room like a final judgment, marking the end of an era that had nearly brought the kingdom to its knees. Queen Isabella remained standing near her throne, watching the doors as if she could still see the woman who had betrayed her trust so completely. Prince Alexander approached his mother with careful steps, understanding that she needed time to process the emotional weight of what had just occurred. The revelation of Victoria's true nature had shaken the very foundations of Queen Isabella's world. For 5 years, she had shared her deepest thoughts and concerns with someone who had been systematically betraying her at every turn. The Queen's hands trembled slightly as she removed her own crown, a gesture that spoke to her profound exhaustion. The ornate piece of royal regalia suddenly felt impossibly heavy, weighted down by the responsibility of protecting a kingdom that had come so close to falling under foreign control. She set it carefully on a nearby table, her movements deliberate and controlled despite her inner turmoil. Captain Blackwood returned to the throne room within the hour, his face grim but determined. He carried with him additional documents that his investigation had uncovered, evidence that Victoria's network of influence had been far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Several minor nobles and court officials had been receiving payments from Ravencrest agents, creating a web of corruption that threatened the kingdom's security. The captain's report revealed that Victoria had been remarkably thorough in her espionage work. She had identified key weaknesses in Eldoria's defenses, documented the kingdom's financial resources, and even compiled detailed profiles of important military leaders. All of this information had been systematically transmitted to Ravencrest through a network of seemingly innocent merchants and travelers. Lady Margaret worked tirelessly to assess the damage that Victoria's betrayal might have caused. Her analysis revealed that several recent policy decisions had been influenced by Victoria's subtle manipulations. Trade agreements that had seemed beneficial to Eldoria actually contained clauses that favored Ravencrest's interests. Military deployments had been adjusted based on Victoria's suggestions, potentially leaving certain border regions vulnerable to attack. Prince Alexander took charge of reviewing the security protocols throughout the castle and the kingdom. His methodical approach impressed even the most experienced advisors, as he demonstrated a natural aptitude for strategic thinking that had been developing throughout his years of preparation for leadership. He understood that rebuilding trust would require transparency and decisive action. The prince's first major decision was to establish a new intelligence network that would be independent of the traditional court structure. He recognized that Victoria's success had been partly due to her ability to infiltrate existing systems of communication and influence. A fresh approach was needed, one that could identify and neutralize future threats before they could take root. Queen Isabella found herself questioning every decision she had made during Victoria's time in the court. She remembered countless conversations where Victoria had offered advice about everything, from taxation policies to diplomatic relations. How many of those suggestions had been designed to weaken Eldoria, rather than strengthen it? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. The broader implications of Victoria's betrayal began to emerge as reports came in from across the kingdom. Local officials who had been appointed based on Victoria's recommendations were being investigated for possible connections to foreign interests. The scope of the infiltration was becoming clearer, and it was more extensive than anyone had feared. Captain Blackwood coordinated with regional commanders to assess the security situation throughout Eldoria. His teams discovered that several strategic locations had been surveyed by unknown individuals in recent months, individuals who had likely been working on Victoria's behalf to gather intelligence about the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The economic implications were equally troubling. Victoria had had access to sensitive financial information about the kingdom's treasury, trade relationships, and resource production. This knowledge could be used by Ravencrest to undermine Eldoria's economy through targeted disruptions or unfair competition in international markets. Prince Alexander called for an emergency session of the Royal Council to address the crisis. His leadership during this critical moment demonstrated a maturity that surprised even his closest advisors. He spoke with clarity and conviction about the need for immediate action to protect the kingdom from further infiltration and to repair the damage that had already been done. The young prince's proposals were both practical and innovative. He suggested establishing new protocols for vetting anyone who sought positions of influence within the government. He also recommended creating multiple channels of communication and decision-making to prevent any single individual from gaining too much control over important matters. Queen Isabella watched her son take charge with a mixture of pride and sadness. She was grateful that Alexander possessed the strength and wisdom necessary to guide the kingdom through this crisis. But she also felt a deep sense of personal failure. As the reigning monarch, she bore ultimate responsibility for allowing Victoria to gain such a position of trust and influence. The investigation into Victoria's network revealed connections to merchants, diplomats, and even some members of the clergy who had been unknowingly compromised. The scope of Ravencrest's infiltration operation was impressive in its breadth and sophistication. It had taken years to establish and would require significant effort to fully dismantle. Messages began arriving from neighboring kingdoms as news of Victoria's exposure spread throughout the region. Some rulers expressed sympathy and offered assistance in dealing with the security threat. Others seemed concerned about their own vulnerability to similar infiltration attempts. The incident was becoming a catalyst for broader discussions about regional security and cooperation. Captain Blackwood's men worked around the clock to secure the kingdom's borders and monitor for any suspicious activity. They were particularly focused on preventing Victoria from attempting to return or from communicating with any remaining agents who might still be operating within Eldoria. The captain understood that the next few weeks would be critical for the kingdom's security. The emotional toll on the royal family was significant. Queen Isabella had not only lost someone she had considered family, but she had also discovered that her judgment could be catastrophically flawed. The knowledge that she had come so close to losing her kingdom through misplaced trust would haunt her for years to come. Prince Alexander recognized that his mother needed time to recover from the betrayal, but he also understood that the kingdom could not afford to wait. He began taking on more of the day-to-day responsibilities of leadership, demonstrating a readiness for kingship that had been accelerated by the crisis. The transition of power was happening naturally, driven by necessity rather than ceremony. As the sun set on that historic day, Eldoria was a changed kingdom. The threat had been exposed and neutralized, but the scars would take time to heal. The crown was secure in Prince Alexander's capable hands, but the price of that security had been a harsh lesson in the eternal vigilance required to protect freedom and sovereignty from those who would destroy them through deception and betrayal. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria's dramatic exile from Eldoria, and the kingdom was still reeling from the revelations of her extensive spy network. Prince Alexander had spent every waking hour working with Captain Blackwood and the royal advisors to root out the remaining elements of foreign influence that had taken hold during Victoria's time in power. The young prince's dedication to protecting his realm had impressed even the most skeptical members of the nobility. The formal ceremony to officially transfer the crown to Prince Alexander was scheduled for the following month. But Queen Isabella had already begun the process of transitioning authority to her son. She recognized that his handling of the Victoria crisis had demonstrated his readiness to lead, and the kingdom needed strong, decisive leadership during these uncertain times. Captain Blackwood presented his final report on the security sweep that had been conducted throughout the realm. His investigation had uncovered 12 individuals who had been directly compromised by Ravencrest agents, including 2 minor nobles, several merchants, and a handful of court officials. Each had been quietly removed from their positions and faced charges of treason against the crown. The captain's findings revealed the sophisticated nature of Ravencrest's infiltration strategy. Rather than relying on obvious spies, they had focused on identifying individuals with existing grievances against the Eldorian government and gradually converting them into assets. Victoria had been the coordinator of this network, using her position as queen consort to identify potential recruits and facilitate their corruption. Prince Alexander studied the intelligence reports with growing concern about the broader implications of what they had discovered. If Ravencrest had been able to establish such an extensive network in Eldoria, it was likely that they had similar operations underway in other neighboring kingdoms. The threat was regional rather than local, requiring a coordinated response from multiple allied nations. Lady Margaret worked tirelessly to assess the policy changes that would be needed to prevent future infiltration attempts. Her recommendations included new procedures for background investigations of anyone seeking positions of trust within the government, enhanced security protocols for sensitive information, and improved coordination between different branches of the kingdom's administration. The economic impact of Victoria's betrayal was becoming clearer as trade specialists analyzed the agreements that had been negotiated during her time in the court. Several contracts contained provisions that would have gradually shifted economic advantage to Ravencrest over time. Renegotiating these deals would be challenging but necessary to protect Eldoria's long-term prosperity. Queen Isabella found herself struggling with the psychological aftermath of the betrayal. Sleep came reluctantly, filled with dreams where she questioned every conversation she had ever had with Victoria. The woman who had shared her table, advised her on matters of state, and even comforted her during moments of grief, had been systematically working to destroy everything Isabella held dear. The Queen's emotional recovery was complicated by the knowledge that she would need to remain strong for her people. Public confidence in the monarchy had been shaken by the revelation that a foreign spy had gained such intimate access to the royal family. Isabella understood that any sign of weakness or uncertainty on her part could further undermine the stability that Alexander would need to govern. Effectively, Prince Alexander's approach to leadership during this crisis had been marked by remarkable composure and strategic thinking. He had established daily briefings with all department heads, created new channels of communication between regional commanders, and implemented a system of checks and balances that would make it much more difficult for any single individual to accumulate dangerous levels of influence. The Prince's decision to establish an independent intelligence service, separate from the traditional court structure, was proving to be particularly effective. This new organization was staffed entirely by individuals who had been thoroughly vetted and had no previous connections to the compromised networks. Their first assignment was to monitor communications with neighboring kingdoms for signs of similar infiltration attempts. Captain Blackwood had been working closely with his counterparts in allied nations to share information about Ravencrest's tactics and methods. The intelligence exchange had revealed that at least 3 other kingdoms had experienced suspicious activities that might be connected to similar espionage operations. The discovery suggested that Eldoria's experience was part of a much larger campaign of regional destabilization. The captain's investigation had also uncovered evidence that Victoria's network had been planning more than just intelligence gathering. Documents found in a hidden compartment of her former chambers suggested that they had been preparing for a more active phase of operations that would have included sabotage of critical infrastructure and possibly even attempts to assassinate key government officials. Prince Alexander convened a special session of the Royal Council to discuss the broader security implications of what they had learned. His presentation to the assembled nobles was comprehensive and sobering, detailing not only the immediate threats that had been neutralized, but also the ongoing vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed to prevent future attacks. The young prince's proposals for strengthening the kingdom's defenses were both practical and far-reaching. He suggested establishing new alliances with trusted neighboring kingdoms, improving the training and equipment of the royal guard, and creating redundant systems for critical government functions that would be harder to compromise through infiltration. Queen Isabella watched. Her son addressed the council with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Alexander's competence and wisdom were evident to everyone in the room, but his rapid maturation into a leader had been forced by circumstances rather than natural development. She wondered if he would ever have the opportunity to experience the carefree aspects of youth that had been sacrificed to the demands of protecting the kingdom. The nobles who had initially supported Victoria's suggestions now faced the uncomfortable reality of their own vulnerability to manipulation. Many of them had prided themselves on their political sophistication, yet they had been completely deceived by someone who had seen them merely as tools to be used for foreign interests. The experience had humbled even the most arrogant members of the court. Lord Harrison, who had been one of Victoria's strongest advocates, requested a private audience with Prince Alexander to discuss his role in the near disaster. The conversation was difficult but necessary, as the future king needed to understand how even well-intentioned advisors could be led astray by skilled manipulators. The discussion also served to rebuild trust between the prince and a nobleman whose expertise would be valuable. In the years ahead, the broader population of Eldoria was beginning to learn about the extent of the threat that had been neutralized. Prince Alexander had decided that transparency was essential for maintaining public confidence, so he authorized the release of carefully edited information about Victoria's betrayal and the steps being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. The response from the people was overwhelmingly supportive of the royal family's handling of the crisis. Citizens appreciated being trusted with the truth about the dangers their kingdom had faced, and they expressed confidence in Prince Alexander's ability to protect them from future threats. The honesty and competence displayed during the crisis had actually strengthened the monarchy's relationship with its subjects. As preparations for the formal coronation ceremony began, Prince Alexander reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few short weeks. He had entered this period as a prince learning to lead, but the Victoria crisis had transformed him into a king ready to rule. The crown that would soon rest on his head would carry the weight of hard-won wisdom about the eternal vigilance required to protect freedom and sovereignty from those who would destroy them through deception and betrayal. The coronation of Prince Alexander was scheduled to take place in just 2 weeks, but the events surrounding Victoria's betrayal had transformed what should have been a celebration into a ceremony of renewal and strength. Queen Isabella had made the difficult decision to abdicate her throne voluntarily, recognizing that her son's leadership during the crisis had proven his readiness to rule, and that a fresh start was exactly what the kingdom needed. Captain Blackwood stood before a detailed map of the kingdom, marking locations where his security teams had identified and neutralized the remaining elements of Victoria's spy network. The cleanup operation had been more extensive than anyone had anticipated, revealing just how deeply foreign influence had penetrated Eldorian society. Every major city had harbored at least one compromised individual, and several important trade routes had been monitored by Ravencrest agents. The captain's work had also uncovered a disturbing discovery in the castle's ancient archives. Documents suggested that this was not the first time Ravencrest had attempted to infiltrate Eldoria through marriage and political manipulation. Similar efforts had been made generations earlier, but they had been less sophisticated and ultimately unsuccessful. The historical pattern suggested that the neighboring kingdom viewed the conquest of Eldoria as a long-term strategic objective. Prince Alexander spent his days reviewing every aspect of the kingdom's governance, preparing to assume the full responsibilities of kingship under circumstances that no royal education could have adequately prepared him for. His conversations with experienced advisors revealed the complexity of ruling a nation that had been systematically undermined from within. Every policy decision would need to be carefully examined to determine whether it served Eldoria's interests or had been influenced by foreign manipulation. The prince's approach to preparing for his reign was methodical and thorough. He insisted on personally reviewing the credentials and loyalties of every individual who would play a significant role in his administration. This process was time-consuming but necessary, as the Victoria incident had demonstrated how catastrophic it could be to place trust in the wrong person. Lady Margaret had been working with financial experts to assess the economic damage caused by Victoria's influence over trade policies and resource allocation decisions. The analysis revealed that while the immediate impact was manageable, the long-term consequences could have been severe if the manipulation had continued for several more years. Ravencrest's strategy had been designed to gradually weaken Eldoria's economy while strengthening their own position in regional markets. Queen Isabella found herself confronting the emotional reality of stepping down from the throne she had occupied for over 2 decades. While she was confident in Alexander's abilities and recognized the necessity of the transition, the decision represented a profound personal loss. The crown had been not just a symbol of authority, but also a connection to generations of ancestors who had sacrificed to build and protect the kingdom. The Queen's abdication speech was carefully crafted to explain her decision to the people of Eldoria, while maintaining confidence in the monarchy as an institution. She spoke honestly about the mistakes that had been made and the lessons that had been learned, while emphasizing her complete faith in Prince Alexander's ability to lead the kingdom into a more secure and prosperous future. Preparations for the coronation ceremony required significant modifications to traditional protocols. The usual celebration of continuity and tradition needed to be balanced with acknowledgement of the crisis that had precipitated the early transfer of power. Prince Alexander wanted the ceremony to serve as both a beginning and a healing process for a kingdom that had been deeply wounded by betrayal. Captain Blackwood's security arrangements for the coronation were the most extensive in Eldorian history. Every guest would be thoroughly vetted, and multiple layers of protection would surround the ceremony. The captain understood that Ravencrest might view the coronation as an opportunity for disruption or even an assassination attempt, and he was determined to prevent any such tragedy. The international implications of Eldoria's experience with foreign infiltration were becoming increasingly apparent as other kingdoms shared their own concerns about similar threats. Prince Alexander had been corresponding with allied rulers about the need for improved intelligence sharing and coordinated defensive measures. The Victoria incident was serving as a wake-up call for the entire region about the sophistication of modern espionage techniques. Prince Alexander's vision for his reign was shaped by the harsh lessons learned during the crisis. He planned to establish new institutions that would make the kingdom more resilient against future threats, while preserving the values and traditions that made Eldoria worth protecting. His approach balanced increased security measures with a commitment to maintaining the openness and trust that had always characterized Eldorian society. The prince had also been working to repair relationships with neighboring kingdoms that might have been damaged by Victoria's activities. Some rulers had received misleading information about Eldoria's policies and intentions, creating unnecessary tensions that needed to be addressed. Prince Alexander's diplomatic efforts were focused on rebuilding trust and establishing more secure channels of communication between allied nations. The discovery of Victoria's true loyalties had also raised questions about the marriage alliances and diplomatic relationships that had been established during her time in the court. Several agreements would need to be reviewed and, potentially, renegotiated to ensure that they truly served Eldoria's interests, rather than advancing Ravencrest's long-term strategic objectives. Queen Isabella's final weeks as monarch were spent documenting everything she had learned about the art of governance, creating a comprehensive guide that would help Alexander avoid the pitfalls that had nearly destroyed the kingdom. Her writing was honest and self-critical, acknowledging the warning signs she had missed and the decisions she wished she could reverse. The relationship between mother and son had deepened during this period of crisis and transition. Prince Alexander had gained a new appreciation for the burden his mother had carried for so many years, while Queen Isabella had discovered that her son possessed strength she had not fully recognized. Their conversations about leadership and responsibility had become more honest and profound as they prepared for the formal transfer of power. Captain Blackwood's investigation had also revealed the existence of escape routes and hidden passages within the castle that Victoria had identified for potential use in emergency situations. These discoveries led to a comprehensive review of the castle's security features and the installation of new protective measures that would make it much more difficult for anyone to move through the building undetected. The approaching coronation ceremony was being planned as more than just a transfer of power from mother to son. It would serve as a renewal of the compact between the monarchy and the people of Eldoria, a promise that the lessons learned from Victoria's betrayal would make the kingdom stronger and more secure. Prince Alexander understood that his reign would be defined not just by the crown he would wear, but by the wisdom gained through surviving a crisis that could have destroyed everything his ancestors had built. As the final preparations for the coronation ceremony proceeded, the kingdom of Eldoria stood poised to enter a new era under the leadership of a young king who had been tested by fire and proven worthy of the trust his people were about to place in him. The crown would pass to hands that had already demonstrated the strength and wisdom necessary to protect the realm from those who would seek to destroy it through treachery and deception. The morning of the coronation dawned bright and clear, as if the kingdom itself was celebrating the beginning of a new era. King Alexander, as he would soon be known, stood before the great mirror in his chambers, wearing the ceremonial robes that had been worn by Eldorian monarchs for centuries. The deep blue fabric was embroidered with golden threads that caught the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, creating patterns that seemed to dance across the rich material. Captain Blackwood entered the chamber with a final security briefing, his expression serious despite the celebratory nature of the day. His teams had been working throughout the night to ensure that every aspect of the ceremony would proceed safely. The captain's vigilance had been heightened by intelligence reports suggesting that Ravencrest agents might attempt to disrupt the coronation. As a final act of defiance, the great cathedral was filling with representatives from across the kingdom and beyond. Nobles, merchants, craftsmen, and common citizens had all gathered to witness the historic moment when Prince Alexander would officially become King Alexander the First. The diversity of the crowd reflected the inclusive nature of Eldorian society and the broad support that the new monarch enjoyed among his people. Queen Isabella made her final preparations for the ceremony that would mark the end of her reign and the beginning of her son's. She wore a gown of silver and white, symbolizing the transition from active rule to the honored position of Queen Mother. Her composure was perfect, but those who knew her well could see the mixture of pride and sadness in her eyes as she prepared to pass the crown to the next generation. The cathedral's ancient bells began to ring as the procession formed outside the castle gates. The sound echoed across the capital city and beyond, announcing to all of Eldoria that their new king was about to be crowned. Citizens lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the ceremonial parade, their faces filled with hope and anticipation for the future that Alexander would help create. Captain Blackwood's security arrangements were invisible to the celebrating crowds but comprehensive in their scope. His guards were positioned at every strategic point along the processional route and throughout the cathedral. The captain himself would remain close to the royal family throughout the ceremony, ready to respond instantly to any threat that might emerge. The procession began with representatives of the various guilds and professions that formed the backbone of Eldorian society. Blacksmiths, farmers, merchants, and scholars all participated, demonstrating the connection between the monarchy and the people it served. Their presence emphasized that Alexander's kingship would be built on the foundation of a strong and diverse society. Lady Margaret walked with the royal advisors, carrying the official records that documented the transition of power and the new policies that King Alexander had developed during his preparation for the throne. Her role in the ceremony was both ceremonial and practical, as she would formally present these documents to the new king as part of the coronation ritual. The cathedral doors opened to reveal an interior transformed for the occasion. Banners representing every region of the kingdom hung from the vaulted ceiling, while flowers from across the realm created a carpet of color leading to the altar. The ancient stone walls seemed to pulse with the energy of the gathered crowd, creating an atmosphere of reverence and celebration. Prince Alexander entered the cathedral with measured steps, his bearing reflecting the gravity of the moment and the weight of responsibility he was about to assume. The crowd fell silent as he walked down the aisle, understanding that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in their kingdom's history. The young man who had proven himself during the Victoria crisis was about to become their king. Queen Isabella followed her son, her own procession marking the end of an era that had seen both triumphs and challenges. Her reign had ultimately been defined not by the mistakes that had nearly cost the kingdom its independence, but by the wisdom and strength she had shown in recognizing and correcting those errors. Her voluntary abdication had demonstrated a level of selflessness that would be remembered for generations. The Archbishop of Eldoria stood ready to perform the coronation ceremony, his ancient words carrying the authority of centuries of tradition. The crown that would soon rest on Alexander's head had been worn by kings and queens who had faced invasions, plagues, and political upheavals. Each had added their own legacy to the continuing story of the kingdom's survival and growth. The ceremony itself was both deeply traditional and uniquely modern. While the ancient rituals were observed with perfect precision, the content of the oaths and promises that Alexander made reflected the lessons learned from recent events. He swore not only to protect the kingdom from external enemies, but also to remain vigilant against the internal threats that could prove equally dangerous. Captain Blackwood watched every face in the crowd, his trained eyes searching for any sign of hostile intent. The ceremony was proceeding flawlessly, but the captain's experience had taught him that danger could emerge even in the most carefully controlled environments. His hand remained close to his sword hilt throughout the proceedings, ready to defend his new king at a moment's notice. The moment of crowning approached as Queen Isabella stepped forward to place the crown on her son's head. This departure from tradition, normally the Archbishop would perform this honor, symbolized the voluntary nature of the transition and the mother's confidence in her son's readiness to rule. The gesture was deeply personal while remaining profoundly symbolic. As the crown settled onto Alexander's head, the weight of kingship became real and immediate. The young man who had faced his first major crisis as a prince was now King Alexander, responsible for the welfare and security of an entire kingdom. The cheers that erupted from the assembled crowd seemed to carry the hopes and dreams of a people ready to follow their new monarch into an uncertain but promising future. The bells of the cathedral began to ring again, joined by bells throughout the capital and across the kingdom. The sound announced to all of Eldoria that they had a new king, one who had already proven his ability to protect them from those who would do them harm. The coronation was complete, but the real work of building a stronger and more secure kingdom was just beginning. King Alexander raised his hand to acknowledge the cheers of his people, understanding that this moment of celebration would soon give way to the daily challenges of governance. The crown on his head represented not just authority but also service, not just power but also responsibility. The lessons learned from Victoria's betrayal would guide his reign as he worked to ensure that such a threat could never again come so close to destroying everything his ancestors had built. 6 months had passed since King Alexander's coronation, and the kingdom of Eldoria had settled into a new rhythm under his leadership. The young monarch had proven himself to be both decisive and thoughtful, implementing the security reforms that had emerged from the Victoria crisis while maintaining the openness and prosperity that characterized Eldorian society. The crown that had nearly been lost to foreign manipulation now rested securely on the head of a king who understood the constant vigilance required to protect it. Captain Blackwood stood in the newly constructed intelligence center, reviewing reports from the network of agents and informants that King Alexander had established throughout the region. The sophisticated operation was designed to detect and counter threats before they could gain a foothold in Eldorian society. The lessons learned from Victoria's infiltration had been transformed into practical defensive measures that were already proving their worth. The intelligence network had uncovered evidence that Ravencrest was indeed operating similar infiltration campaigns in at least 4 neighboring kingdoms. King Alexander had shared this information with allied rulers, leading to the formation of a regional security alliance that coordinated efforts to identify and neutralize foreign spies. The cooperation between kingdoms had grown stronger as they recognized their shared vulnerability to sophisticated espionage operations. Queen Mother Isabella had found her new role both challenging and rewarding. No longer burdened with the daily responsibilities of ruling, she was able to focus on projects that had always been close to her heart, including education and cultural preservation. Her experience with Victoria's betrayal had also made her a valuable advisor to other rulers who were grappling with similar security concerns. The economic policies that King Alexander had implemented were showing positive results throughout the kingdom. By renegotiating the trade agreements that Victoria had influenced and establishing new partnerships with trusted allies, Eldoria was experiencing renewed prosperity. The king's approach balanced economic growth with security considerations, ensuring that future trade relationships would be beneficial rather than exploitative. Lady Margaret had been promoted to serve as the kingdom's chief intelligence analyst, a new position that reflected the importance King Alexander placed on understanding and countering foreign threats. Her work involved not just gathering information, but also developing the analytical frameworks needed to identify patterns and predict future attacks. The role suited her intellectual abilities and her deep commitment to protecting the kingdom. The castle itself had been transformed by the security improvements that Captain Blackwood had implemented. While maintaining its historic character and welcoming atmosphere, the ancient structure now incorporated modern defensive features that would make it nearly impossible for unauthorized individuals to move through the building undetected. The balance between security and accessibility reflected King Alexander's broader approach to governance. King Alexander's marriage to Lady Catherine of Westmarch had been announced the previous month, bringing joy to a kingdom that had been scarred by the betrayal of the previous queen consort. Lady Catherine's background had been thoroughly investigated, and her family's loyalty to Eldoria stretched back generations. The engagement represented not just personal happiness for the king, but also a symbol of renewal and hope for the future. The wedding preparations were being conducted with the same attention to security that had characterized King Alexander's entire reign. Captain Blackwood was working closely with Lady Catherine's family to ensure that every aspect of the ceremony would be safe while still allowing the people of Eldoria to celebrate with their beloved monarch. The event would demonstrate that the kingdom had emerged stronger from its recent trials. Reports from the borderlands indicated that Ravencrest had been attempting to test Eldoria's new defensive measures through small-scale incursions and intelligence-gathering operations. Each attempt had been detected and countered by King Alexander's improved security apparatus, sending a clear message that the kingdom was no longer vulnerable to the tactics that had nearly succeeded during Victoria's time. The regional security alliance that King Alexander had helped establish was proving to be one of his most significant achievements. The coordinated intelligence sharing and mutual defense agreements had created a network of protection that made it much more difficult for any single kingdom to be isolated and manipulated. The alliance had already prevented 2 attempted infiltrations and had identified several foreign agents operating in the region. King Alexander's approach to diplomacy had been shaped by his understanding of how deception and manipulation could undermine even the strongest kingdoms. His negotiations with foreign representatives were characterized by careful verification and multiple layers of confirmation. Trust was earned gradually, rather than granted automatically, and all agreements included provisions for ongoing monitoring and verification. The educational reforms that King Alexander had implemented were designed to prepare future generations of Eldorians to recognize and resist foreign manipulation. The curriculum now included courses on critical thinking, information analysis, and the history of espionage and political deception. Young people would grow up with a better understanding of how to protect themselves and their society from those who would exploit their trust. Captain Blackwood's investigation into historical records had revealed that Victoria's infiltration had been more successful than similar attempts in the past because of advances in communication and transportation that made coordination with foreign handlers much easier. The captain's analysis of these changes had led to new countermeasures that addressed the technological aspects of modern espionage. The psychological impact of Victoria's betrayal had been addressed through a careful campaign of transparency and education. King Alexander had authorized the release of detailed information about how the infiltration had been discovered and neutralized, helping citizens understand both the seriousness of the threat and the effectiveness of the response. The knowledge had increased rather than decreased public confidence in the monarchy. Queen Mother Isabella's memoirs, currently being written with Lady Margaret's assistance, would provide future historians with a detailed account of the Victoria crisis and its resolution. The project was also serving as a form of therapy for the former queen, allowing her to process the emotional trauma of the betrayal while creating a valuable resource for understanding how such threats could be identified and countered. The economic prosperity that Eldoria was experiencing under King Alexander's leadership had attracted positive attention from trading partners throughout the region. The kingdom's reputation for stability and security was actually enhanced by the manner in which the Victoria crisis had been handled. Other rulers recognized that Eldoria's experience and improved defenses made it a more reliable and trustworthy ally. King Alexander's daily routine included regular briefings from Captain Blackwood and the intelligence team, ensuring that he remained constantly aware of potential threats to the kingdom. The young king had learned that vigilance was not a burden, but a responsibility that came with the crown. His careful attention to security matters had become second nature, integrated into every aspect of his leadership. As the first anniversary of Victoria's exposure approached, King Alexander reflected on how dramatically his life and his kingdom had changed. The crisis that could have destroyed Eldoria had instead made it stronger, more secure, and more united. The crown that Victoria had tried to steal for foreign masters now rested firmly on the head of a king who understood its true value and the constant effort required to protect it. The kingdom of Eldoria had emerged from its greatest crisis in generations not just intact, but transformed. Under King Alexander's leadership, it had become a model for other nations struggling with similar threats. The young monarch, who had been tested by betrayal and proven worthy of his crown, was now leading his people into a future that promised both security and prosperity. The lessons learned from Victoria's deception would guide the kingdom for generations to come, ensuring that such a threat could never again come so close to destroying the freedom and independence that defined the Eldorian spirit.